You think having pointless meetings is the worst part of a job? History would like a word. Forget long hours and annoying bosses. We're about to explore the job so fundamentally bizarre, so utterly disgusting, they feel like they were invented as a practical joke. From professional party puker assistants to living lawn ornaments, these were real careers. So get ready to reevaluate your entire professional life, because these are the jobs that prove humanity has tried and failed at almost everything. 1. Let's begin our journey in ancient Rome, where the elite treated feasting not as a meal, but as an endurance sport. When you've been gorging on stuffed dormice and peacock brains for 6 hours, you eventually hit a wall, or rather, your stomach does. But the Romans had a disgusting solution. They employed a slave known as a vomit collector. This poor soul's entire job was to silently stand by with a basin during lavish banquets, ready for any guest who needed to make some room for the next course. It was a human reset button for competitive eating. Imagine your whole professional purpose being to facilitate another person's gluttony by catching their half-digested appetizers, all while maintaining a polite and professional demeanor. It's the ultimate customer service nightmare. 2. In the golden age of con artists, you couldn't just sell a bottle of useless tonic. You needed a show. And every great show needs a great opening act. Enter the Toad Eater, the profoundly dedicated assistant to a traveling charlatan doctor. His job was to get the crowd's attention by publicly eating what were claimed to be venomous toads. He would then perform a spectacular act of being poisoned, convulsing, frothing at the mouth, and looking like he was about to meet his maker. Just in the nick of time, his boss would swoop in and administer the miracle cure. The Toad Eater would leap up, perfectly healthy, and the crowd would eagerly buy the fake medicine. This wasn't a one-time gig. This was your daily grind. A career built on faking your own death by amphibian poisoning. 3. Forget crystal balls or reading palms. If you truly wanted to know your future in some corners of history, you needed to consult a tyromancer, a professional cheese psychic. Yes, you heard that right. This was a form of divination where the seer would predict your fate by analyzing a block of aging, molding cheese. They would interpret the patterns of the mold, the placement and size of the holes, and the sheer funk of the aroma to tell your fortune. I can only imagine the readings. The pungent aroma of this Roquefort foretells a passionate romance, but this ominous green vein of mold suggests he will be terrible with money. Your destiny is clear, but I wouldn't recommend eating the prophecy. It's a career that gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, cutting the cheese. 4. In the royal courts of Tudor England, there was one position with a title so bizarre it sounds like a joke, yet it was one of the most powerful jobs in the kingdom, the groom of the stool. His official duty was to attend to the king during his most private moments on the royal commode. This wasn't just a glorified bathroom attendant. He was the chief of staff for the king's digestive tract. He was responsible for monitoring the monarch's bowel movements for signs of illness, which meant he had unparalleled, intimate access to the king every single day. Because of this, the groom of the stool often became the king's closest friend and most trusted advisor, wielding immense political influence. It just proves that in the Game of Thrones, the path to power is sometimes through the royal toilet. 5. Back in ancient Rome, being wealthy meant being impeccably groomed, and for men, that included being completely free of underarm hair. Since this was a task far too undignified for a nobleman, it created a highly specialized and frankly weird profession, the alipilus, or the armpit plucker. Stationed in the bustling public baths, these slaves had one and only one job: to meticulously pluck the armpit hairs of wealthy patrons using a set of bronze tweezers. This wasn't a side hustle for a bath attendant who also gave massages. Your entire career, your whole identity in the service industry was centered on the armpits of strangers. One has to wonder if there was a career ladder. Did you start on less prominent citizens and work your way up to plucking a senator? 6. By the 18th century, the British aristocracy had everything: massive estates, endless wealth, and a crippling sense of boredom. So, how do you spice up your perfectly manicured garden? You hire a living garden gnome, of course. This was the job of the ornamental hermit, a man paid to live in a purpose-built grotto or hermitage on the estate grounds. The job description was strict. You couldn't wash, cut your hair or nails, and you had to wear a druid-like robe at all times. In exchange for food and a place to live, your only duty was to be seen wandering the grounds, looking thoughtful and profound for the amusement of the landowner and his guests. It was less of a job and more of a long-term, deeply weird performance art piece where you were just another piece of scenery, like a fountain or a particularly interesting shrub. 7. The title gong farmer sounds almost quaint, doesn't it? Perhaps someone who cultivates a specific type of crop. Well, they were cultivating something, but it wasn't pleasant. In Tudor England, gong was slang for dung, and a gong farmer's job was to empty the city's cesspits and latrines. This wasn't just a dirty job, it was a deadly one, and it could only be done at night. Armed with shovels and buckets, these brave souls would descend into pits of human waste, risking disease and suffocation from the toxic fumes, all to keep the cities from drowning in their own filth. The smell was so overpowering that they were often forced to live on the outskirts of town. On the bright side, the pay was exceptionally good, presumably because you had to be compensated for having the single worst-smelling job in human history. 8. This next job is less about being dumb and more about being profoundly tragic and bizarre. In parts of rural Britain, when a person died, their family might hire a sin-eater. This outcast, usually one of the poorest people in the village, would be called to the home of the deceased. There, a loaf of bread and a bowl of ale would be passed over the body, symbolically absorbing the dead person's sins. The sin-eater would then consume the bread and ale, and in doing so, take all those sins into his own soul, allowing the deceased to enter heaven unburdened. For this vital spiritual service, he would be paid a tiny fee and then immediately shunned. He was a walking vessel of everyone else's damnation, a necessary pariah whose job was to eat the spiritual darkness of his community. 9. Imagine being born into royalty. It sounds perfect, right? Except for one tiny detail: you can't be punished. A prince is a divine representative, and striking him would be an insult to the throne. So, how do you teach a bratty young prince a lesson? You outsource the consequences. This created the job of the whipping boy, a young nobleman of the same age who was educated alongside the prince and became his close friend. But there was a catch. Every time the prince misbehaved, flunked his Latin, broke a priceless vase, or was just being a general pain, his whipping boy was taken away and punished instead. The theory was that the prince, seeing his best friend suffer for his mistakes, would be overcome with guilt and learn his lesson. It was a bizarre, emotionally manipulative form of discipline, and arguably the worst take-your-kid-to-work day in history. 10. The Roman Empire gave us aqueducts, concrete, and intricate road systems, but their approach to laundry was less sophisticated. If you were a fuller in ancient Rome, your job was to clean the togas and tunics of the citizenry. Your main cleaning agent? Stale, fermented human urine. Yes, you read that correctly. Large vats were filled with cloth, water, and urine collected from public receptacles. The ammonia in the aged pea was a powerful, if pungent, bleaching agent. And how did they agitate this delightful mixture? They didn't have washing machines, so the fullers, often slaves, would spend all day stomping on the clothes with their bare feet, much like pressing grapes for wine, but infinitely more disgusting. It was a career that required a strong stomach and a complete lack of a sense of smell. 11. For centuries, bloodletting was a go-to medical treatment, and the star of the show was the humble leech. But where did doctors get their supply? They got them from a leech collector, a person whose job was one of the most painfully literal in history. To collect the leeches, these individuals, typically from the poorest classes, would wade into stagnant, marshy ponds using their own legs as bait. They would stand there, motionless, as the blood-sucking worms attached themselves to their skin. Once their legs were covered, they would wade back to shore, carefully pluck off their now engorged harvest, and sell them by the dozen. It was a profession where the main occupational hazards were significant blood loss, nasty infections, and the sheer psychological horror of being a walking, talking buffet for parasites. 12. Here's a job with a name that is a masterpiece of euphemism: the pure finder. It sounds almost noble, like someone searching for truth or virtue. In reality, they were searching for dog droppings. In Victorian London, tanneries needed a substance to soften and prepare leather for processing, and the ammonia-rich dung from dogs known as pure was perfect for the job. So the pure finder would walk the streets, pail and scraper in hand, collecting this canine waste. The fresher, the better, apparently. It was a disgusting, foul-smelling job, but it was a vital part of the leather industry. One can only imagine the professional pride involved. "I'm not just a collector," a pure finder might say. "I'm a purveyor of the finest, most potent pure this side of the Thames." Suffrages, 13. Before the invention of alarm clocks, how did an entire industrial workforce get up on time? They relied on a much more personal and frankly annoying service: the knocker-upper. This was a human alarm clock whose sole job was to walk the dark streets of industrial towns in the early morning and wake up their clients. They used long, lightweight poles, often made of bamboo, to tap on bedroom windows on the upper floors. For others, they might use a rattle or even a pea shooter to fire dried peas at the window pane. They would not leave until they were sure the worker was awake and out of bed. There was no snooze button, no gentle melody, just the persistent, inescapable tapping of a stranger at your window, reminding you it was time to go to the factory. 14. The Victorian era was a time of incredible scientific discovery, which also made it a golden age for scientific quackery. Enter the medical electrician, a showman with a flair for pseudoscience who claimed to cure almost any ailment with the miracle of electricity. These charlatans would set up elaborate machines with dials, wires, and buzzing electrodes, promising to fix everything from baldness and anxiety to gout and paralysis. Patients would sit in a chair and have mild, or sometimes not so mild, electric currents pass through their bodies. The doctor would put on a grand performance, convincing the patient that the tingling sensations and muscle twitches were proof that the electrical balance of their body was being restored. It was literally shock therapy for a common cold. 15. He was a master of marketing, a pioneer of the pop-up shop, and a complete and utter fraud. The snake oil salesman is one of history's most iconic bad jobs, both for the seller and the buyer. These charismatic con artists would travel from town to town, often with a flashy wagon and an elaborate stage show selling their miracle tonics. The snake oil they peddled rarely contained any actual snake oil, but it was often packed with alcohol, opium, or other narcotics, which would make the user feel better temporarily, ensuring repeat business. They sold a potent cocktail of lies and false hope, promising to cure everything from colic to cancer, all while knowing their product was, at best, a useless distraction and, at worst, a dangerous concoction. 16. Imagine working in a 19th century cigar factory. The air is thick with smoke, the work is mind-numbingly repetitive, and the days are long and silent except for the rustle of tobacco leaves. To combat the crushing boredom, workers came up with a brilliant solution. They would pool their money to hire a factory lector. This was a man who would sit on a raised platform in the middle of the factory floor and read aloud for the entire shift. They would read from classic novels by authors like Dickens or Tolstoy, recite poetry, or deliver the day's news from the local papers. It was a job that required a powerful voice to be heard over the factory's bustle, and it turned the grim workspace into a place of learning and culture. It's a strange but wonderful job that proves even in the toughest conditions, people still crave a good story. 17. In the opulent and often cruel world of royal courts, entertainment took many forms, some more unsettling than others. For centuries, it was a high-status symbol for a monarch to have a court dwarf as part of their entourage. These were individuals with dwarfism who were kept at court, their official job being to entertain the king and his guests. They were often dressed in lavish miniature costumes and were expected to be witty, perform tricks, or engage in staged comedic antics. While some were treated with a degree of affection and held positions of relative influence, they were fundamentally seen as curiosities or living novelties. Their existence was a performance, their identity reduced to a source of amusement for the powerful, a permanent and public spectacle. 18. A trip to the Roman baths was a cornerstone of daily life, a place for socializing, business, and of course, getting clean. But the Roman method of bathing didn't involve soap and a washcloth. Instead, after covering their bodies in oil, bathers would call for an attendant, usually a slave, armed with a strigil. This was a curved metal scraper used to literally scrape the mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt off the skin. The job of the strigil-wielding bath attendant was to meticulously go over every inch of the patron's body, scraping away the grime. It was an intensely personal, physical, and frankly disgusting job, especially considering the sheer volume of sweaty, oily bodies they had to degrime every single day. They were the human squeegees of the ancient world. 19. The roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the life and death struggle of gladiators. The Roman Colosseum was the epicenter of brutal entertainment. But after the spectacle was over and the crowds went home, someone had to clean up the mess. That was the job of the gladiator sandraker. These workers, known as herinarii, would enter the arena floor, which was covered in a thick layer of sand to absorb blood. Their grim task was to rake over the blood-soaked sand, remove stray body parts, drag away corpses, and generally tidy up the place for the next day's carnage. It was a janitorial job in the most extreme environment imaginable, where part of your daily cleanup might involve finding a severed limb or a few teeth left over from the main event. 20. During the terrifying waves of plague that swept through Europe, society began to break down, but one essential service had to continue: collecting the dead. This led to the creation of the plague bearer, or cartman. His job was as simple as it was horrifying. He would guide a cart through the deserted, plague-ridden streets, ringing a bell and calling out the now infamous phrase, "Bring out your dead." Families would then carry their deceased loved ones out of their homes and place them onto the cart. The plague bearer would then transport the bodies to massive, hastily dug plague pits for burial. It was a job that required an almost unimaginable level of emotional fortitude and a near-suicidal disregard for one's own safety, as contact with the bodies meant almost certain infection and death. 21. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools had a massive demand for cadavers for anatomical study, but a very limited legal supply. This created a lucrative and macabre black market, serviced by a new kind of criminal, the resurrectionist. Better known as body snatchers, these men worked under the cover of darkness, lurking in graveyards to dig up the freshest corpses from recent burials. They had to be quick, quiet, and strong, hoisting the body out of the coffin and transporting it to a waiting surgeon or medical school for a handsome fee. It was a ghoulish trade that preyed on the grief of families and blurred the line between scientific necessity and outright grave robbing. They weren't just digging for bodies, they were digging for profit. 22. In ancient Rome, before the establishment of a formal public fire brigade, firefighting was a privatized and deeply corrupt business. Imagine your house is on fire, you're panicking, and then a fire warden shows up with his crew and their buckets of water. But instead of putting out the flames, he starts negotiating. These early fire brigades, led by wealthy men like Marcus Crassus, would often refuse to fight the fire until the distraught property owner agreed to sell the burning building to them on the spot for a ridiculously low price. If you agreed, they'd put out the fire they now owned. If you refused, they'd simply stand back and watch it burn to the ground. It was a business model built on extortion and disaster capitalism at its most literal. 23. The whaling industry of the 19th century was a brutal, high-stakes enterprise, and perhaps the most dangerous and disgusting job on the ship belonged to the whale oil processor. After a whale was killed and hauled alongside the ship, massive strips of blubber were cut off and brought on deck. It was the processor's job to chop this blubber into smaller pieces and boil it down in enormous, fiery vats right there on the slippery, rolling deck. They worked amidst choking black smoke, the constant risk of horrific burns from splashing, boiling oil, and the ever-present danger of slipping on the greasy deck and falling overboard into the icy sea. It was a floating factory of filth and danger. all to produce the oil that lit the lamps of the world. 24. In the era before municipal sanitation and recycling programs, cities were filled with discarded treasures, if you knew where to look. This was the domain of the rag and bone man. He would walk the streets with a cart or a sack, calling out his distinctive cry, collecting anything and everything that could be reused or resold. He gathered old rags for paper mills, bones for making fertilizer or glue, scrap metal, old bottles. Nothing was too worthless. He was the ultimate recycler, a one-man salvage crew who played a vital, if unglamorous, role in the urban ecosystem. It was a hard, dirty life of scavenging, but it was a profession built on the simple, timeless principle that one man's trash is another man's livelihood. 25. Being a king or emperor came with a lot of perks, but it also came with a very specific occupational hazard: assassination by poison. To counter this ever-present threat, rulers employed a pregustator, or in simpler terms, a food taster. This person's entire job was to eat a small portion of every single dish and drink a sip of every beverage prepared for the monarch moments before it was served. If the taster remained standing and didn't start convulsing in agony, the meal was deemed safe. It was a position of immense trust, often given to a loyal slave or confidant, but it came with the world's worst job requirement. You had to be willing to die from a poisoned mushroom so your boss wouldn't have to. Every single meal was a high-stakes game of Russian roulette with a fork. 26. The cozy image of a crackling fireplace in a Victorian home had a dark and dirty secret: the chimney sweep. The soot that lined the chimneys was highly flammable, so it had to be regularly cleaned out. But these chimneys were often incredibly narrow, sometimes no more than 9 inches square. The only way to clean them was to send someone small enough to crawl up inside. This led to the horrific practice of using young boys, often orphans sold into the trade, as climbing boys. They were forced to shimmy their way up through the pitch-black, suffocating flues, scraping away the soot with their bare hands. They suffered from burns, lung diseases, and the constant risk of getting trapped and suffocating to death. It was a brutal, exploitative job that turned children into disposable tools. 27. Warfare has always been dangerous, but some jobs on the battlefield push the boundaries of sanity. Consider the cannonball catcher, a job that existed for a short period in the age of early artillery. Armies quickly realized that iron was expensive, so recycling enemy cannonballs was a smart economic move. This led to soldiers, often enticed by extra pay, being tasked with running out onto the active battlefield during a cannon barrage to collect enemy cannonballs that had landed but not buried themselves too deeply. You had to dodge incoming fire, locate a heavy iron ball, and haul it back to your own lines, all while the battle raged around you. It was a job that required you to be part fast, part strong, and almost entirely insane. The risk-to-reward ratio was, to put it mildly, not great. 28. Long before the Marquis of Queensberry rules introduced gloves and rounds, there was bare-knuckle prize fighting. This wasn't boxing as we know it. It was a brutal, almost lawless form of combat that was a popular spectacle in the 18th and 19th centuries. The job of a bare-knuckle prize fighter was to simply beat his opponent into submission, no matter how long it took. Fights had no time limits and could last for hours, sometimes over 70 or 80 rounds, ending only when one fighter could no longer stand. Broken bones, shattered teeth, and grotesque swelling were standard. It was a grueling test of raw endurance and pain tolerance, a career where your primary skill was the ability to both deliver and absorb an astonishing amount of punishment. 29. In the Middle Ages, if you had a toothache, needed a haircut, and also required a minor surgery, you didn't go to 3 different specialists. You went to one guy, the barber surgeon. These jacks of all trades were the go-to practitioners for the common person. They would cut your hair 1 minute and amputate a gangrenous limb the next. Their iconic red and white striped pole originally symbolized blood and bandages. They were masters of bloodletting, tooth extraction, and lancing boils, all performed with the same unsterilized tools they used for a shave. While some were skilled, the profession was completely unregulated. meaning your chances of getting a good haircut were probably about the same as your chances of surviving the subsequent infection. 30. Mining has always been a dangerous profession, but the job of the mine powder man was in a league of its own. This was the man responsible for handling the explosives used to blast through rock deep underground. His job was to drill holes, pack them with unstable black powder, or early dynamite, and then light the extremely short fuses. And this is the crucial part. He had to do this by hand, and then run for his life through the narrow, dark, and treacherous tunnels before the blast went off. A moment's hesitation, a misplaced foot in the darkness, or a slightly too fast fuse could mean instant death. Every single workday involved a series of timed sprints away from a powerful explosion that you personally initiated. 31. The prized delicacy of bird's nest soup is made from the nests of the swiftlet, a bird that builds its home out of its own solidified saliva. The problem is, they build these nests high up on the sheer faces of coastal cliffs and in the vast dark recesses of deep caves. This created the incredibly perilous job of the bird's nest collector. For centuries, men in Southeast Asia have been risking their lives, climbing hundreds of feet up precarious, handmade bamboo scaffolds or flimsy ropes to reach these nests. One wrong move, one piece of rotten bamboo, meant a fatal fall onto the rocks or into the sea below. It's a job that requires the agility of a mountaineer and a complete absence of the fear of heights, all for a bowl of soup. 32. The image of a lighthouse keeper is often romanticized, a solitary figure watching over the sea. But for those stationed at remote, wave-battered lighthouses, the reality was a form of psychological torture. The job wasn't just about polishing the lens and lighting the lamp. It was about enduring crushing, absolute isolation for months on end, sometimes with only one other person for company. You were trapped in a stone tower, surrounded by a raging sea, with storms so violent they could shake the entire structure and send waves crashing over the top. The constant solitude, the relentless noise of the wind and waves, and the sheer monotony drove many keepers to madness. It was a job where the greatest danger wasn't the sea, but the deafening silence of your own mind. 33. In the chaos of an ancient or medieval battlefield, a soldier's primary job was to stay alive. But the standard bearer had a different, far more dangerous purpose. His job was to hold the unit's flag, or standard, high and visible at all times. This flag was the heart of the regiment. It was a rallying point, a symbol of honor, and a crucial tool for communication in the smoke and confusion of battle. Because of this, the standard bearer was an immediate and primary target for the enemy. Killing the standard bearer and capturing the flag would demoralize the entire unit. So your job was to make yourself the most obvious, non-moving target on the battlefield, a magnet for arrows, bullets, and enemy charges. It was a position of great honor, but with a life expectancy that was brutally short. So there you have it, a graveyard of careers so absurd they make your job look like a genius invention. But history is a vast and bizarre place, and we've only scratched the surface. We've shown you the toad eaters, the sin eaters, and the professional armpit pluckers. Now you tell us, what's the one unbelievably dumb job from history that we were foolish enough to miss? Dig deep. Prove you know an even weirder corner of the past in the comments below. And if we earned your gratitude for not having to do any of these, pay it forward by hitting like and subscribing for more historical madness.